Good afternoon to you. Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane Outlook and discussion now for Monday, the 29th of August, 2016. Quite a bit on the plate today to discuss, so let's get right into it. We have Gaston out in the Atlantic, TD number 8 and 9 also out there, Hurricane Lester in the Eastern Pacific, and then Hurricane Madeline in the Central Pacific area of responsibility. I will cover them all here. You can tell, looking at the map here, the Tropical Weather Outlook map, we also have our system trying to come off the coast of Africa. Going to be moving west with time. We'll talk about that towards the end of today's discussion. Gaston just piling up the ace points. Really, that's about it. Think of it as the high score of the game basketball player. It's scoring the most points right now, obviously, because it is the strongest of the systems. And the ace score is the accumulated cyclone energy. It's a way to measure the true quality of a system. Let's say that all 5 of these that we see today, every one of these, let's say they were all tropical storms or hurricanes. This would be the strongest of the 5, and so it's got the most wind energy being expended, and thus the highest ace score. The rest of these might be different levels of strength, and they would be lower ace producers overall. It only matters in the end of the season when we tally everything up, and it gives the scientists sort of a look at how the quality of the season was, rather than just looking at the quantity of the storms that did form. So looking in the Central Pacific here, Hurricane Madeline approaching the Hawaiian Islands here. Actually, I've got it pulled up right here, so that's better. And we're going to have to really watch this closer than I thought yesterday. The cone of uncertainty certainly covers Hawaii, the big island here. The center is forecast to go south. That's just the eye, the center of the hurricane. Obviously, the effects extend well away from that center. And if this is the actual track, let's say this is spot on from today, then you can see that Hawaii would be here in this right front quadrant of the storm relative to its movement. And that would put Hawaii on sort of the nastier side of this hurricane. You'll have a strong northeasterly flow as the hurricane approaches, and then as it goes by, those winds will turn around out of the south and southeast, buffeting both sides of the island here, and that's going to produce some pretty big wave action, dangerous surf conditions, squally weather, the potential for very heavy rainfall, and what we have to hope for here is that it doesn't come in like this and then dip south or right over. We'll have to wait and see. This is a good sign that it's dipping south of Hawaii, the big island itself, over the last couple of forecast cycles. The rest of the island chain, very little impact unless this shifts more to the north and comes in across like this. But let me emphasize again, these H's in here represent the center of the hurricane, which we can see in this satellite picture. That's the center of the hurricane that those dots represent as it moves along. You can see that the influence extends well away from that center. So just keep that in mind. Just because the center, when people say it's not supposed to hit Hawaii, it's going south of us. That is an incorrect statement. The eye is forecast to go south of Hawaii, but the hurricane as a whole, and that's what I talk about when I say it is going to pass close enough to Hawaii to give them some appreciable effects, if not downright nasty. So be ready for that. All right, so going back to the map here, Hurricane Lester is next up. This is a satellite image animation of Lester. We can worry about this more in the coming days. It too could be headed towards Hawaii. The good news is usually once you have one following the other, it's harder for the following storm to be as strong. Not always the case, but we can worry about this in a couple of more days as time progresses and we see how things shake out, especially with Madeline first. All right, in the Atlantic Basin, our vorticity signature chart here from the University of Wisconsin. Pretty round appearance to Tropical Depression 9, as also the case with TD number 8, but this doesn't have much convection associated with it. And there's the signature for Gaston, energy trying to come off Africa, and our area of interest just off the Texas coast, which really is not going to do too much over the coming days, which is good news. So looking at the wide Atlantic Basin animated satellite loop, we're going to look at the visible satellite. And the sun comes up over the western hemisphere. That's what that line that moves across is. And there's Gaston, again, just an ace producer right now. And here is our tropical depression. This might be getting close to tropical storm strength. We're going to take a close-up look at it in a moment. And then there's TD number 8 rotating off the Carolina coast. Really not much more than a few passing squalls, heavy rains, a few gusty winds from time to time, and an increase in local surf conditions should be about the extent of it for that system. So let's look at the floater imagery here, where we zoom in, if you will, on the various items of note. First, we'll take a look at the visible satellite loop of tropical depression number 9. Boy, am I glad to not be calling it 99L any longer. As this loads up, you can see how it's doing this morning. The wind shear, and I'm going to show you that in just a moment, still impacting it, but you can tell it's really trying to develop that deep convection there on the western side of Cuba, just on the north side of the island there, and pretty vigorous overall low-level circulation. It's doing its darndest to get going, and it's sitting over very warm upper ocean heat content right now. There it is there. So very high values of upper ocean heat content, meaning that the warm water extends way down in the Gulf instead of just at the surface. And that's going to be important as this evolves over time. I'll go back and look at that again in a moment. This is the upper level chart. Here it is, the depression right there. And then there is the upper level anticyclone that's favorable. If this feature right here was sitting on top of the system instead of just to its west, we would have what's basically on its way to being a hurricane right now. Because that is the signature that you look for, an upper level anticyclone in the upper levels of the atmosphere, sitting over the top of one of these systems to help the air sort of fan out and dissipate in the upper parts of the atmosphere. And it's interesting because there's an anticyclone just to the west-northwest, right here. See? I'll fill it in for you. There's the anticyclone here, and there's Gaston. So why is the northerly shear not affecting Gaston here? This is green, but over here we have reds and yellows. Well, it's all dependent upon the strength of those upper level winds, and across the top of Gaston over here, we're only looking at less than 20 knots or so, 15, 10, 20 knots, whatever. And it's close enough, the center of it, the core, right there, to the area of calmer winds that is not really being impacted as much. And it's just interesting that even though these both have these anticyclonic circulations near them, that TD number 9 is still struggling to some extent. So let's go back and look at the tracking map for tropical depression number 9, and we'll talk about its future over the next couple of days in the Gulf of Mexico, if I can get here. Come on. All right, so TD number 9 obviously has the biggest, I guess, concern for the near future for Florida especially, and certainly Madeline out in the Pacific for Hawaii. Don't want to underscore that enough and don't want to de-emphasize it, but in the Gulf, a lot of concern here for TD9, and it looks like maybe this is going to strengthen, become a tropical storm. It would be called Hermine. I doubt TD8 out here is going to make it first. It could, but I think this is going to do so this afternoon. And then the landfall threat up here in the Big Bend area seems to be the most likely scenario. As I mentioned yesterday, this part of the Florida coastline very susceptible to storm surge. So even a 50, 60, 70 mile per hour tropical storm moving in that direction, pushing the water ahead of itself while doing so, poses a threat for fairly significant coastal inundation, and we need to watch that very carefully. It's been a long time since we've had a significant impact in Florida from a tropical system. We had Colin that was up in this region back in the earlier part of the year. I think it was Colin, if I have my names and events right. And so beyond that, we really haven't had much to deal with in more than 10 years. So in the next day or so at the longest, we're going to really start talking about impacts here. We don't have a named storm yet, so I'm going to hold off on trying to determine who's going to experience what in this region until we get that named storm designation, assuming we do so, and we see how this pans out then. All right? So for now, the model guidance and fairly good agreement A lot of the more reliable models clustering here on that Big Bend area of Florida. There is a decent amount of them, though, coming up towards the area near Panama City Beach, for example, west of the 85 degrees longitude line, which goes right there. So west of Apalachicola, for example. We'll have to see how this pans out. I think, it looks pretty likely, as you can see from this, that Florida, somewhere from the region just north of Tampa, all the way over to Pensacola, would be in play. A couple of outliers here farther to the west, but these are the less, these are not the dynamic models. These beta and advection models, really not as advanced as the rest of the modeling, indicating this landfall threat more or less to the Big Bend area is where it looks to be concentrated the most. So let's take a look at the GFS output. This is the very latest run at the 850 millibar level. I really like this to show the health of the system without looking at precipitation, surface pressure, any of that stuff. If the 850 millibar vorticity signature looks like junk, then the rest doesn't matter. You understand that? It's kind of like, the internal U. If you don't, they do a CAT scan and they say, oh man, you're riddled with all kinds of problems, then the rest doesn't matter, what you look like on the outside. If everything's bad on the inside, then it's not good news, right? And that's a terrible analogy, but you get the idea. Why even worry about the surface pressure? Why even worry about what the precip shields are going to look like? Let's see what the internal structure, or in this case, the 850 millibar, which is the lower part of the atmosphere, around 5,000 feet or so. If that looks healthy, then we have something to deal with, and we can look at the rest of the parameters after that. So that being said, this is what it's going to be tomorrow morning, Tuesday morning, August 30th. There it is over the Gulf of Mexico. Kind of an oval shape to it, so that's not, it's right off the bat, it's not a big indicator that this is strengthening. 48 hours out, so this is Wednesday morning. Thursday morning, it starts to become a little bit better organized in here, but still kind of an oblong shape where the center, sort of the bullseye, starts to take on more vorticity, more energy and spin. But at this point, the National Hurricane Center in their discussion today mentioned what are called baroclinic processes getting involved. Basically energy in the atmosphere coupling with the system itself, sort of forcing it to start to get better organized, rather than purely tapping into the warm, moist environment of the Gulf of Mexico. In other words, it starts to get more complicated, and it almost starts to look like a system that you would see in October, for example. Not quite there yet, because it's just the end of August here and the 1st of September, but, yes, it looks like it's strengthening, but it doesn't have the exact same processes involved as a hurricane like Katrina 11 years ago. When it came across, that thing went in full-bore hurricane mode without any baroclinic forcing to get it going. So this is kind of getting an assist from the atmosphere as a good way to look at it. All right, so there's 72 hours at 96. I'm sorry, I forgot I had this in there. This is important, okay? And I apologize for forgetting the extra slide. This is the 850 chart, all right? And this is what it looks like higher up in the atmosphere at the 200 millibar level. And this is where the upper level winds come into play. So the upper level winds are lightest down here, and our system would be located right up in here. So the flow is across the system still, but it's also moving in that direction. So the shear may not be as strong since it's moving with the flow, if that makes sense. And you can also tell, to some extent, the flow is a little bit more divergent here. It's spreading out instead of coming right across the system in a straight line. All right, so that's important too. The air spreading out allows that lift in the atmosphere. We call that divergent flow, and that might aid in the development of this system just a little bit more. Moving on out to 96 hours, now it has jumped the coast and is sitting here in southeast Georgia, almost 1 foot in the Atlantic Ocean, looking a lot more healthy in the vorticity field. But again, I think that's more the baroclinic forcing from the atmosphere than anything else. Nevertheless, a storm is a storm, and it could make for a pretty nasty Friday morning in areas such as Brunswick, Georgia, Jacksonville, Florida, etc. And looking at the upper atmosphere, no, I didn't put the other one in. That's fine. And finally, at day 5, there it goes out into the Atlantic. Basically, this front that's coming through, this little bit of a trough, and its energy captures this system, slingshots it out into the Atlantic, and gives it a little boost of energy, maybe helping it to develop a little bit more. So that's what it looks like now. It'll change by tomorrow. You know it always does. So what we're concerned about, going back to this map, is what happens here over the relatively, there's some decent ocean heat content amounts in there. It's certainly not anywhere near these values. But the water temperatures in the Gulf on the surface, undisturbed right now, sitting at around 30 Celsius or so, the upper 80s. It definitely has enough fuel to work with. It'll be a matter of how much organization does it have and how quickly can it start to consolidate its center to start to develop over those very warm waters. We don't know yet. We're going to have to just keep watching. And like I said, hopefully by tomorrow and certainly by Wednesday morning we can start talking about impacts even more. And I may very well be getting ready to hit the road to go to Florida. We'll talk about that more tomorrow as well. Finally, on our stop today on this rather lengthy discussion, a lot of talk about the system trying to come off of Africa over here, very large area of energy. A couple of things I've noticed with this. The first, which is very obvious, a very large dust outbreak. Well, not so much large as it is intense. It's right in here. So this is a pretty substantial dry pocket, sort of preceding this system coming off Africa here. And the models have not really been as aggressive developing this early out here, more later over here towards the Antilles. So we're going to have to see. I'm starting to become rather suspect that we're going to see prolific development in this area despite the above normal water temperatures throughout this region, simply because of all the dry mid-level air that seems to just be there semi-permanently now. So that's good in one regard, that these take a little bit longer, in the case of what's now TD9, a lot longer to develop. But it's bad because it gets them farther over to the west, towards the western basin, where all of us good people live over here. In fact, this is what it looks like at 120 hours, September the 3rd, Saturday. There it is, south of a very thick ridge of high pressure in the atmosphere, over the Atlantic, moving basically west to slightly north of west. We'll definitely be watching this, but don't be surprised if it struggles to develop until somewhere in this region instead of way out here. I might be wrong about that, but nothing else has done too much. Well, Gaston did, but it sputtered too, even out in this area. It took it a while to get going. And look what it did. Once it reached those higher latitudes, it started to become stronger, and now we have what was a major hurricane yesterday. So go figure. All right? A lot of stuff going on to keep up with. That is for darn sure. Thanks for keeping up with it today. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. As always, thanks for tuning in. And I might do another video discussion this evening, depending on what we have with TD number 9 and the other situations out there. If not, I'll talk to you again tomorrow.